coming to you from my home. Yes, I am working remotely. And like so many other people, I have been embracing the experience. It has been interesting, to say the least. And for the most part, it has been fairly enjoyable. I have to say, I've enjoyed spending time with my cute little puppies who are running around the house right now. And for them, life has been grand, all right? They have their mommy at home. They're able to have her play with them, even during the daytime when normally I wouldn't be here. They have mommy on call for sure. They're still running outside and playing in the yard. So for them, their life has really been the same. But for my life, it's been quite different. It's been different primarily in how I do my work. So working remotely, I'm not at Nevada State College on campus amongst the hustle and the bustle of being around students, being around my coworkers. And that's always a really exciting aspect of working at a college. It's the ability to connect with the campus community. And as a community resources coordinator, I'm all about how I can be out in the community, how I can formulate partnerships for the betterment of our students, betterment of the faculty and of the staff. But I'm having to really figure out how to navigate that from my home. And so when I think about my cute little dogs, right, their life hasn't really changed very much. But for me, things have changed a lot. So when we think about the coronavirus, we also have to consider the ways in which the coronavirus has impacted people differently. And so for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the coronavirus and the social inequality. All right, so before I jump into some facts and figures about social inequality and how the coronavirus has impacted our community and individuals within our community differently, I want to share with you a quick story. So before I began working remotely, I was actually working on a community resources list, and that list is now available on the NSC website.
Visit nsc.edu. Click the Learn More link on the COVID-19 information banner. Next, click on Community Resources.
That was really a project to put together in such a very short amount of time, but it was important not only for myself, but my entire department to make sure that everyone had access to resources within the community and knew about these resources in the community. So putting that list together, I had the opportunity to reach out to some local businesses and ask them, hey, how has the coronavirus impacted you personally and also as well as your business and your employees? So when reaching out to various businesses, I talked to one woman who's a small business owner, and she owns a daycare center. Now, some of you may be thinking, why are daycare centers still open? Public schools have been closed, charter schools and private schools have been closed, but daycare centers are considered an essential business, and it makes a lot of sense. There are so many individuals who are essential in their own jobs, and they need childcare, safe and reputable places to take their kids. Nurses, doctors who are on the front lines having to treat patients, particularly those who have been impacted health-wise by the coronavirus. So daycare centers are essential to our communities. But when talking with her, she was really struggling not only in terms of keeping her doors open, but struggling health-wise. This woman suffered with chronic asthma, but she was coming to work every day exposed to children who could be carriers of the coronavirus. And she was really scared. But at the same time, she was put into a situation where she couldn't afford to close the doors. Now, the sad part about it is that her story is reflective of so many stories within America. So I think it's important that we take the time to really dissect how the coronavirus has created social inequality within our communities. Right, Jasmine? Let's get to it.
So I talked about a woman who is a small business owner in Southern Nevada. She is considered an at-risk or vulnerable person to the novel coronavirus or COVID-19. However, cannot afford to close the doors to her business. In an article published by Time magazine, Alana Samuels discussed how the coronavirus is widening the gap between the social classes. Those who are less educated tend to be in service industry jobs that require human interaction or human contact. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, approximately 86% of U.S. workers hold service industry jobs. These jobs often come with economic risks because of inconsistent shift hours and low pay. For instance, during a teleconference, Governor Steve Sisolak requested from the president a stimulus package for the hospitality industry. His request is much needed as many individuals are without work in Las Vegas, a city that is reliant on tourism. People in service industry jobs often don't receive paid sick time or vacation days. And based on a survey conducted by the Federal Reserve, 4 in 10 workers have difficulty covering a $400 emergency. This difficulty then translates into inequalities in buying power. For instance, Clark County officials, as well as the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, have urged residents not to over-purchase. Though we may fear a lack of available resources, the fear is currently unfounded. Furthermore, it creates difficulty for those who may only have a limited income to find affordable food and toiletry options because others with more income have overshopped. Therefore, it is essential to consider the needs of all those living in our communities. Please watch this recently released PSA from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.
In the last few days, we've seen a lot of people shopping in excess, causing a lot of empty shelves within our stores. However, some people think that this is due to the lack of supplies or items within the valley. In truth, we are here at the Smith's Distribution Center where there's a lot of different supplies getting loaded up to the trucks and ready to go to the stores. Over shopping causes the stores to be completely empty. So when there's elderly people or people at risk that are coming in to shop, they don't have the supplies that they need. And because over shopping, there's people that are just storing their items within their house, when in reality, it's something that somebody else can be using for that day. One of the things that we've been asking the people to do is social distancing, create some distance between each other. However, a lot of people are flocking to the stores, waiting in long lines, and being close to proximity to each other just because they're waiting for some of these supplies to come in. If people are to go shopping, limit to the stuff that you need for the week. There are more supplies coming in, so focus on the things that are needed, allowing other people to be able to get the things that they need. If you are taking too many supplies, there's going to be a limit on what others can take, and some people may run out of certain things. One of the reasons why we're asking you to do this is so you can be kind to one another. As a police department, we see people panicking, and panic allows people to do some dumb things. So one of the things that we're asking is just calm down, take what you need, and be kind to one another.
In a New York Times article titled, "As Coronavirus Deepens Inequality, Inequality Widens Its Spread," authors Max Fisher and Emma Bubola describe the coronavirus and social inequality as creating a feedback loop. They described how those in lower socioeconomic classes are more likely to contract certain diseases, like the novel coronavirus. Why, may you ask? Individuals of lower socioeconomic status often lack access to adequate health care, cannot sufficiently treat pre-existing conditions like heart disease and diabetes, are unable to take off time from work, and are living in close proximity to others who too are suffering from similar circumstances. These stressors can lead to an increase in social vulnerabilities, like racial animosity and deaths related to alcoholism and even suicide. Research suggests that those of lower socioeconomic status live shorter than average lives. As the gap increases between the haves and have-nots, previous social and economic disparities are only likely to worsen in the wake of COVID-19. Therefore, it is important that communities come together, irrespective of social class, because the coronavirus does not discriminate, and health inequalities ultimately put us all at risk. Now let's hear from Dr. Pao Vu, the Director for the Office of Community Engagement and Diversity Initiatives, about social stratification and COVID-19's impact on a global scale.
Thank you, Kimberly. So what is inequality and what is social stratification? Inequality, as I've talked with other fellow social scientists before, I actually recall a conversation with a friend of mine who's an economist who was saying, inequality is simply just inequality. Some people make more, some people make less, some people have more, some people have less. And yeah, inequality objectively is simply just a status of one person having more than another. And so I can agree with that inequality is simply the status of people having more or less, the haves versus the have-nots. We haven't even begun to talk about why people have and why people don't have certain things. All we're saying is that things are unequal. Social stratification then gets a little bit more specific. But before we get there, let's also talk about a related concept, social differentiation. Social differentiation is just how people have distinct qualities or social roles. We aren't yet saying that one social role or status or quality is more important than another, or that it's more worthwhile than another. That gets more so at social stratification, and we'll return to that in just a moment. There are two very basic types of statuses that people may have. First is through ascription. So ascribed statuses are attributes that people have at birth, they develop over time, or that they possess through no effort or fault of their own. Some examples of this are people's race, sex, their age. These things people don't have control over for the most part. And yes, you can change your sex through an operation, but for the most part, if you are born male, female, intersex, for the most part that is your sex, unless if you go through hormones and through an operation. Now, gender is different. Gender reflects an achieved status or through achievement. Achieved statuses are acquired through some combination of personal choice, effort, and ability. So you can perform masculinity, you can perform femininity, and so you can perform gender. Gender is performative, and so it reflects an achieved status. Other examples of achieved statuses are your level of educational attainment, your occupation. These things do reflect some effort or ability, some personal choice that you've made. So another example is if you are a felon. That is an example of another example of achievement, or at least an achieved status. For Harold Kerbo, so the content that I'll be talking about today comes mostly from a book, Social Stratification and Inequality, Class Conflict in Historical, Comparative, and Global Perspective. And once again, it's by Harold Kerbo. So for Kerbo, there are three criteria for social class. First is your occupational structures. Occupational structures reflects the type of position that you may have in society, whether it's in terms of the work that you do, whether it's blue collar, white collar work, or even pink collar. So if you are garbage collect in terms of working in waste management, working in K through 12 education, working in corporate America, these things reflect occupational structures. Authority structures reflect how much power you hold within society, but also within your own occupation. These are also interconnected. But how much power do you have over your own life? How much power do you have in influencing how you live your life in society? So political power, these things reflect authority structures. Property structures are your amount of income. Notice again, these things can be interconnected. Occupational structures reflect the position that you have. Authority structures reflects how much power you actually have in society over the type of work that you do, over the decisions that are made in society. Political power, property structures reflect more so the type of wealth that you have. If you own a home, if you rent, these reflect property structures. If you have investments into stocks, bonds, your level of income that you bring in for a month, a week, these things also reflect property structures. Now, if we start thinking about other theorists, let's just say Karl Marx, in how he defined class, it was simply about property structures, the haves versus the have-nots. And the essential division between the two was basically the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Your bourgeoisie were the individuals that have stuff in society. Those are your capitalists. They owned everything in society. And your proletariat were your laborers, your laboring class who worked to basically survive in society, live from paycheck to paycheck to survive. Now, yes, there are also your petite bourgeoisie and your lumpen proletariat, but for the most part, class was relatively simple in dividing the haves, the social class into two groups, the haves versus the have-nots. But let's start defining more so what social stratification is now. Social stratification is the systematic process of categorizing and ranking people on a scale of social worth, thus affecting their life chances. But what are life chances? It's a critical set of potential social advantages, including everything from the chance to stay alive during the first year of birth to the chance to view fine art. So the chance to stay alive during the first year after birth, access to health care, access to food and prenatal care. All these things matter in terms of shaping one's life. The chance to view fine art. These things may affect your children's interests. These things, just simply having the ability to be exposed to fine art. And we're not even talking about how SAT questions and other standardized tests may be culturally biased. So if you were exposed to Mozart at a young age, if you were exposed to Picasso at a young age, similar types of materials might actually end up showing up in a SAT question. So for example, on some of these standardized tests, they might ask you, a teacher is to a classroom as a blank is to a symphony. Well, how can you respond to that question if you've never been exposed to things such as classical music, if you've never been exposed to what makes up a symphony? Also included in life chances are the chance to remain healthy, grow tall, and if sick, get well again quickly. So again, we're talking about access to healthcare, the chance to avoid becoming a juvenile delinquent. It's not just by coincidence that income and also neighborhoods in which children grow up in, it ends up increasing or decreasing the likelihood that they're going to engage in criminal behavior during their during their K through 12 years when they're still a juvenile. And very crucially, the chance to complete intermediary and higher education grade. So access to higher education, whether you can even get into college, these things matter in terms of affecting your life chances. So as a summative question for what sociologists ask when studying social stratification is who gets what and why. That's the big part that makes it social stratification rather than simply just observing inequality. We aren't just observing inequality, we are trying to understand why these inequalities actually exist. After World War II and the fall of communism in the 1980s, the US, Germany, and Japan ended up being the largest industrial nations at the end of the 20th century. And I mean that both militarily as well as economically. And as a result of this concentration of wealth and power, it created what sociologists have referred to as a modern world stratification system. In this new system or modern form of stratification or economic system, it extended beyond the political and national boundaries of what we've seen in other political and economic systems. While this theory is at its core a conflict theory, it ended up reproducing some of the ideas from Neil Durkheim, whom sociologists and other social scientists have referred to as a functionalist theorist. There are elements from Durkheim that talks about, in this theory, that talks about the division of labor and how there's mechanical and organic solidarity. Specifically, there are transnational entities, and these transnational entities are essentially these major corporations such as Walmart. They may end up being within one country, owned from one country, and yet operating in another. Walmart is just one of those examples. And these major corporations are able to move very easily from one boundary, one area, to another. In one year, they might be operating in terms of its factories and businesses out of one country such as El Salvador, and then in the next they might be in China, and then in the next they might be in another country, essentially operating across numerous countries, sometimes at the same time, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of running its other retail businesses, and other corporate entities. So in its class divisions in modern world stratification systems, there are basically three different class divisions. First, there are your core economies. These economies are economically diverse, they're wealthy, they're both economically and militarily powerful. These examples include US, Japan, Germany. Peripheral economies are much like that of the lower or working classes, but they are the least economically diversified. There's less division of labor within its own economy. There's high income inequality, and they are heavily influenced by the core economies. Some examples of these nations, these economies, include Laos, Haiti, and El Salvador. And last but not least, there's your semi-peripheral economies that are essentially are very similar to the middle class, in between the upper and the lower working classes. And what characterizes the semi-periphery economies are that they are moving toward an industrial nation and are thus less likely to be manipulated by the core. They have some military and economic power to be in that middle area. So some of the countries that occupy this middle area include Mexico, Thailand, and Taiwan. Some interesting cases that have been difficult for theorists to categorize include China and Vietnam. They've been inconsistently categorized because, for example, Vietnam, many of the people in their country live in extraordinary poverty, and yet, in terms of their purchasing power, and some of their people do relatively well and are not in such dire circumstances similar to, say, Laos, Haiti, and El Salvador. And so in some instances, they might be characterized more so accurately like a semi-peripheral economy. China is in a similar boat, that while you may categorize them as a country that gets in which their labor is heavily exploited. If you go to Walmart, if you go to many different stores, Target, no matter what store you may prefer, look on the back of the packages, they'll say made in China, but that's because most of the world exploits China for its labor. And so in some ways you can say they're periphery, and yet in terms of how they turn around and exploit some of the neighboring countries, you can also say that they're semi-peripheral, that they have the ability to exploit some of their neighbors. And yet at the same time, they're so economically powerful that they've literally loaned us in the US trillions of dollars to help us get out of our Great Recession during the Obama administration. And so in many ways, it's difficult to categorize where people occupy, where countries occupy. This modern world system has contributed to great inequality within the US and within the world. What we end up seeing is that there's core economies that end up competing with each other, and that corporate interests ends up being advanced all around the world. There is this race to the bottom. And what this race to the bottom is where you have these corporate entities, such as, say, Walmart, where they will bid, they'll actually have countries literally bid for them to actually go there to have their manufacturing plants or other businesses there, where countries will basically compete for the lowest rates. If China says that they're willing to have their workers work for $3 an hour, another country might be throwing in a bid and say that, well, we're willing to, in our country, willing to have our workers work for $2 an hour, and they're willing to work 7 days a week, 10, 12 hours a day. And so this really is a race to the bottom, where instead of looking out for the interests of workers, in the US, we have this idea that the longer you stay committed to an employer, that over a period of time we'll make more money because of our commitment to different businesses. And yet at the same time, what we're essentially doing is countries are bidding with their lowest bid. So year after year, they have to continue to say that we are willing to work for less. And so corporations are basically able to pick up and move because some of these countries are willing to say that, hey, we'll give you all a tax break for 5 years. We're willing to give you a tax break for 3 years. We're willing to throw in a manufacturing plant for you if you're willing to move here, a warehouse for you if you're willing to move here, move your business here. And so essentially every single year, corporations are basically getting these bids from countries and are able to pick up and move very, very easily. At the same time, you also have the effect of businesses, world banks. Some of the largest shareholders for the World Bank are France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the US. You may be thinking, well, the loans that the World Bank engages in benefits the other people all around the world. And yes, they do. In fact, some of the APR is very low when they're lending to some of the other economies, ranging from as little as 0% to up to 6.8% right now through the World Bank, which is great. Compare that to some of the credit cards that are being offered right now in the US, as high as 36%. That's, the World Bank is actually offering very low rates compared to what's being offered in terms of US credit cards. But what does that also say about inequality within the US? Also consider new mortgage loan rates. New mortgage loan rates range between 3% right now on up to about 10%. But let's look at the flip side of the coin for those who have the wealth. If you consider billionaires, 1% of $1 billion ends up being 10 million. And right now, your CDs, your certificates of deposit, on the low end, they are around 1%. On the higher end, and by the way, many of these certificates of deposits, their APR rates are dependent on how much you actually contribute. And so many of these billionaires don't contribute to these small certificates of deposits. They end up investing their money and are able to get higher in returns on their investments. But let's just say, as a conservative estimate, it's only 1% that these billionaires, it's only 1% that these corporations are investing their dollars. And again, 1% is incredibly conservative in terms of investments. That would mean that a person with just $1 billion in 1 year would make $10 million just by letting it sit there and doing absolutely nothing with it. Now, a person can only have one bed. Of course, you can have more than one bed, but how many beds are you going to sleep in? You can pay however many thousands of dollars, but once you have a bed, you have a bed. The same with a car. You can only have so many cars to which you can't even drive them anymore. And so one person essentially can only spend so much within 1 year. But a billionaire, a person that has just $1 billion with, just sitting in the bank, doing nothing with it on a certificate deposit, they'd become a millionaire, make $10 million in just 1 year by letting it sit there. And again, those are very conservative estimates. Most people, if they have investments in, I have investments in my retirement, and usually, minus this year probably, I get a pretty decent return. I get a pretty good return on my investments every single year, more than 1%. Also consider that the richest 1% in the world right now owns 44%, approaching nearly half of the world's wealth. And most of those that actually occupy the richest 1% of the world are indeed millionaires, billionaires, who have quite a bit of wealth. We are talking about very wealthy individuals within the world. Now, the question that we should probably ask right now during this world pandemic that we are all experiencing all over the world, in Italy, in China, in the US, in the UK, in so many different nations right now, something to ask yourself and to ponder about is, how is this inequality affecting the world? And who's being hurt by it the most? Who's got access to health care, to the best health care? Who has access, period, to healthcare? And how are we being treated? What resources do we have access to in terms of food, in terms of the necessities that we need to live? Back to you, Kimberly.
So, from my home to yours, I, and cute little Nina Pearl here, want to wish you health and happiness. Bye, NSC fam and friends. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye, Nene. All right, Blassie, what do you want to tell everybody at home? Please, pretty, please, pretty, please, pretty, please, pretty, please, be safe. Good job, Blassie. Pretty, please. Good girl.